Aesthetics is a branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of beauty and taste, as well as the philosophy of art, its own area of philosophy that comes out of aesthetics. It examines subjective and sensori-emotional values, or sometimes called judgments of sentiment and taste. Hello, and welcome to the Aesthetic Philosophy. In today's video, I'm going to be analysing aesthetics, its idea, what it means, and how it applies to our life. I'm going to be giving an overview of the philosophy behind aesthetics. I'll begin by giving an overview of what exactly is meant by the idea of an aesthetic. Aesthetics covers both natural and artificial sources of aesthetic experience and judgment. It considers what happens in our minds when we engage with aesthetic objects or environments, such as in viewing visual art, listening to music, reading poetry, experiencing a play, exploring nature, and so on. The philosophy of art specifically studies how artists imagine, create, and perform works of art, as well as how people use, enjoy, and criticize their art. It deals with how one feels about art in general, why they like some works of art and not others, and how art can create our moods and even our beliefs. Both aesthetics generally, and the philosophy of art, especially ask the question like, what is art? What is a work of art, and what makes art good? Overall, scholars have defined the idea of aesthetics as critical reflection on art, culture, and nature. In modern English, the term aesthetic can also refer to a set of principles underlying the works of a particular art movement or theory. For example, one would speak of the Renaissance aesthetic. I think we should begin our analysis on aesthetics by looking at the etymology. The word aesthetic is derived from the Greek aestheticus, meaning aesthetic, sensitive, sentient, pertaining to sense and perception. Aesthetics in the central sense has been said to start with a series of articles on the pleasures of the imagination, which the journalist Joseph Addison wrote in the early issues of the magazine The Spectator in 1712. The term aesthetics was appropriated and coined with a new meaning by the German philosopher Alexander Bergenton in his dissertation Meditations Philosophica de Nucilius ad Pomenania de Pendredinos. I really think that's how you say it. In every video I probably mess up a couple words. I'm sorry. Which translates to philosophical considerations of some matters pertaining to the poem in 1735. Bergenton chose the aesthetics because he wished to emphasize the experience of art as a means of knowing. Aesthetics, therefore, is not a very tidy intellectual discipline. It's a heterogeneous collection of problems that concern the arts primarily, but also relate to nature. Even though his later definition of the fragment Aesthetica in 1750 is more often referred to as the first definition of modern aesthetics. I think we can begin our analysis of aesthetics by looking at the overview of aesthetics and the philosophy of art. Some separate aesthetics and philosophy of art claim that the former is the study of beauty and taste, while the latter is the study of art proper, in the form of materialized works and artists. However, most commonly, aesthetics encompasses both questions around beauty as well as the question about art. It examines topics such as aesthetic objects, aesthetic experience, and aesthetic judgments. For some, aesthetics is considered a synonym for the philosophy of art since Hegel, while others insist that there is a significant distinction between these closely related fields. In practice, aesthetic judgment often refers to the sensory contemplation or appreciation of an object, not necessarily an artistic object, while artistic judgment refers to the recognition and appreciation or criticism of an art or an artwork. Philosophical aesthetics not only has to speak about art and to produce judgments about artworks, but also has to give a definition of what art is. Art is an autonomous amenity of philosophy, because art deals with the senses, for example, the etymology of aesthetics, and art is as such free of any moral or political purpose. Hence, there are two different concepts of art in aesthetics: art as knowledge or art as action. But aesthetics is neither epistemology nor ethics. Aestheticians compare historical developments with theoretical approaches to the arts of many periods. They study the varieties of art in relation to their physical, social, and cultural environments. Aestheticians also use philosophy and psychology to understand how people see, hear, imagine, think, and learn, and act in relation to the materials and problems of art, and the problems that art describes. Aesthetic philosophy and psychology therefore studies the creative processes and process and the aesthetic experience. With a tighter definition of what is meant by the study of aesthetics, we can begin to look at aesthetic judgment, universals, and the ethics. Let's begin by analyzing aesthetic judgment. Aesthetics examines our affective domain, response to an object or phenomenon. Judgments of aesthetic value rely on our ability to discriminate at a sensory level. However, aesthetic judgments usually go beyond sensory discrimination. For David Hume, delicacy of taste is not merely the ability to detect all the ingredients in a composition, but also our sensitivity to pains as well as pleasures which escape the rest of mankind. Thus, the sensory discrimination is linked to capacity for pleasure. For Immanuel Kant, as he wrote in his Critique of Judgment in 1790, enjoyment is the result of when pleasure arises from sensation, but judging something to be beautiful has a third requirement. Sensation must give a rise of pleasure or be given by a rise of pleasure through engaging our capacities of reflective contemplation. Judgments of beauty are sensory, emotional, and intellectual all at once. Kant, in 1790, observed of a man, if he says that canary wine is agreeable, he is quite content if someone else corrects his terms and reminds him to say instead, it is agreeable to me, because everyone has his own sense of taste. The case of beauty is different from mere agreeableness, because if he proclaims something to be beautiful, then he requires the same liking from others. He then judges not just for himself, but for everyone, and speaks of beauty as if it were a property of things. Viewer interpretations of beauty may on occasion be observed to possess two concepts of value, aesthetics and taste. Aesthetics is the philosophical notion of beauty. Taste is a result of an education, and a process that lacks awareness or brings awareness of elite cultural values learnt through exposure to mass culture. Bourdieu examined how the elite in society define the aesthetic values like taste, and how varying values of exposure to these values can result in variations by class and cultural background and education. According to Kant, beauty is subjective and universal, thus certain things are beautiful to everyone. In the opinion of Władysław Tarkowski, I think that's how you pronounce it, apologies if it's wrong, I try with all these names, there are 6 conditions for the presentation of art: beauty, form, representation, reproduction of reality, artistic expression, and innovation. However, one may not be able to pin down these qualities in a work of art. The question whether these are facts about aesthetic judgments belongs to a branch of metaphilosophy known as meta-aesthetics. With this in mind, we can begin to look at factors involved in aesthetic judgment. Judgments of aesthetical values seem often to involve many other kinds of issues as well. Responses such as disgust show that sensory detection is linked in instinctual ways to facial expressions and even behaviors like the gag reflex. Yet, disgust can often be a learned or cultural issue too. As Darwin pointed out, seeing a stripe of soup in a man's beard is disgusting, even though neither soup nor beards are themselves disgusting. Aesthetic judgments may be linked to emotions, or, like emotions, particularly embodied in our physical reactions. For example, the awe inspired by a sublime landscape might particularly physically manifest itself with an increased heart rate or pupil dilation. Philosophical reactions or psychological reactions may express or even cause the initial awe. As seen, emotions are conformed to cultural reactions, Therefore, aesthetics is always characterized by regional responses, as Francis Groves was the first to affirm in his Rules for Drawing Caricatures with an essay on comic painting, published in 1788. Francis Groves can therefore be claimed to be the first critical aesthetic regionalist in proclaiming the anti-universality of aesthetics in contrast to the prelieus or the always resurgent dictatorship of beauty and its idea. Aesthetic regionalism can thus be seen as a political statement and stance which vies against any universal notion of beauty to safeguard the counter-tradition of aesthetics related to what has been considered and dubbed an unbeautiful, just because one's culture does not contemplate it. For example, Burke's sublime is what is usually defined as primitive art, or unharmonious, or non-cathartic art, camp art, in which beauty posits and creates dichomalities and its opposites, without even the need for formal statements, but which will be perceived as ugly. Likewise, aesthetic judgments may be made culturally and conditioned to some extent. Victorians in Britain often saw African sculpture as ugly, but just a few decades later, Edwardian audiences saw some of the same sculptures as being beautiful. Evaluations of beauty, therefore, may be well linked to desirability, perhaps even to the sexual desirability. Thus, judgments of aesthetic value can become linked to judgments of economic, political, or moral value. In a current context, one might judge a Lamborghini to be beautiful, partly because of its desirability or its symbol as status. Or we might judge it to be repulsive, partly because it signifies for us overconsumption and offends our political or moral values. The context of its presentation also affects the perception of artwork. Artwork presented in a classical museum context are linked and liked more, and related to it more interesting than what is presented in a sterile laboratory-style context. While scientific and specific results depend heavily on the result of presented artwork, overall the effect of context proved to be more important for the perception of artwork than the effect of genuineness, whether the artwork was being presented as an original or as a facsimile/copy. Aesthetic judgments can often be very fine-grained and internally contradictory. Likewise, aesthetic judgments seem often to be at least partially intellectual and interpretive. It is what a thing means or symbolizes for us that is often what we are judging. Modern aestheticians have coined and asserted that will and desire are almost dormant in aesthetic experience, yet preference and choice have seemed important in aesthetics to some 20th century thinkers. The point is already made by Hume, but see Mary Motherstill in her Beauty and the Critic's Judgment in the Blackwell Guide to Aesthetics, published in 2004. Thus, aesthetic judgments might seem to be based on senses, emotions, intellectual opinions, will, desire, culture, preferences, values, subconscious behavior, conscious decision, training, instinct, sociological institutions, and etc., or some complex combination of these, depending on exactly which theory one employs. A third major topic in the study of aesthetic judgments is how they are unified across art forms. For instance, the source of a painting's beauty has a different character to that of beautiful music, suggesting their aesthetics kind of differ. The distinctibility of language to express aesthetic judgment and the role of social construction further cloud the issue. Let's look at aesthetic universals. The philosopher Denis Dutton identified 6 universal signatures in human aesthetics. Number 1. Expertise or virtuosity. Humans cultivate, recognize, and admire technical artistic skills. Number 2. Utilitarian pleasure. People enjoy art for art's sake, but did not demand that it keep them warm or put food on the table. Number 3. Style. Aesthetic objects and performances satisfy rules of composition to that of a place that places them in a recognizable state. Number 4. Criticism. People make a point of judging, appreciating, and interpreting works of art. Number 5. Elimination and imitation. with a few important exceptions like abstract painting and works of art, stimulate experiences of the world. Number 6. Special focus. Art is a set aside from ordinary life and made a dramatic focus of experience. Artists such as Thomas Hirschhorn have indicated that there are too many exceptions to Dutton's categories. For example, Hirschhorn's installations deliberately eschew technical virtuosity. People can appreciate a Renaissance Madonna for aesthetic reasons, but such objects often had, and sometimes still have, specific devotional functions. Rules of composition that might be read into De Camp's Fountain or John's Cage do not locate the works in a recognizable style, or certainly not a style recognizable at the time of the work's realization. Moreover, some of Dutton's categories seem too broad. A physicist might entertain hypothetical worlds in his/her imagination in the course of formulating a theory. Another problem is that Dutton's categories seek to universalize traditional European notions of aesthetics and art, forgetting that, as André Malraux and others have pointed out, there have been large numbers of cultures which such ideas, including the idea of art itself, were non-existent. So a brief overview of aesthetic ethics would be that aesthetic ethics refers to the idea that human conduct and behavior ought to govern by the way in which is beautiful and attractive. John Dewey has pointed out that the unity of aesthetics and ethics is in fact reflected in our understanding of our behavior being fair, the word having a double meaning of attractive and moral acceptability. More recently, James Page has made the suggestion that aesthetic ethics might be taken to form a philosophical rationale for peace education. An interesting part of aesthetics is the idea of new criticism and the intentional fallacy. During the first half of the 20th century, a significant shift to general aesthetic theory took place, which attempted to apply aesthetic theory between various forms of art, including the literary arts and the visual arts, to each other. This resulted in the rise of the new criticism school and debate concerning the intentional fallacy. As a result, the question of whether the aesthetic intentions of the artist in creating the work of art, whatever its specific form, should be associated with the criticism and evaluation of the final product of the work of art, or if the work of art should be evaluated on its own merit, independent of the intentions of the artist. In 1946, William K. Wimsatt and Monroe Beardsley published a classic and conventional new critical essay entitled The Intentional Fallacy, in which they argued strongly against the relevance of an author's intention and intended meaning in the analysis of a literary work. For Wimsatt and Beardsley, the words on the page were all that mattered. Importation of meanings from outside the text was considered irrelevant and potentially distracting. In another essay, The Affective Fallacy, which served as a kind of sister essay to the intentional fallacy, Wimsatt and Beardsley also discounted the reader's personal and emotional reaction to a literary work as a valid means of analyzing a specific text. This fallacy would later be repudiated by theorists from the reader response to school of literary theory. One of the leading theorists of the school, Stanley Fish, was himself trained by new critics. Fish criticizes Wimsatt and Beardsley in his essay Literature in the Reader, published in 1970. As summarized by Barry's Goat and Livingston in their essay The Creation of Art, they say that structuralists and post-structuralist theorists and critics were sharply critical of many aspects of new criticism, beginning with the emphasis on aesthetic appreciation and the so-called autonomy of art, but they reiterated the attack on biographical criticisms, assumption that the artist's activities and experience were a privileged critical topic. These authors contended that anti-intentionalists, as formalists, hold the intentions involved in the making of art are irrelevant or peripheral to the correctly interpretation of the art. So details of acting of creative work, through possible interest in themselves, have no bearing on the correct interpretation of the work. Goat and Livingstone defined the intentionalists as a distinct form of formalists, stating that intentionalists, unlike formalists, hold that reference to intentions is essential in fixing the correct interpretation of works. They quote Richard Wallingham and state that the task of criticism is the reconstruction of the creative process, where the creative process must be in turn the thought of as something not stopping short but terminating on the work of art itself. A large part of the philosophy behind aesthetics is the derivative forms of aesthetics. A large number of derivative forms of aesthetics have developed as contemporary and transitory forms of inquiry associated with the field of aesthetics, which include the postmodern, psychoanalytic, scientific, and mathematical, among others. Let's break each of these down. Postmodern aesthetics and psychoanalysis. Early 20th century artists, poets, composers challenged existing notions of beauty, broadening the scope of art and aesthetics. In 1941, L.I. Siegel, American philosopher and poet, founded aesthetic realism, the philosophy that reality itself is aesthetic, and that the world and the world itself, art and self, explain each other. Each is the aesthetic oneness of opposites. Various attempts have been made to define postmodern aesthetics. The challenge to the assumption that beauty was central to art and aesthetics, thought to be original, is actually continuous with older aesthetic theory. Aristotle was the first in Western tradition to classify beauty into types as his theory of drama, and Kant made a distinction between beauty and the sublime. What was new, however, was a refusal to credit the higher status of certain types, where the taxonomy and implied a preference for tragedy, and the sublime to comedy and the rococo. Croce suggested that expression is central in the way that beauty was once thought to be central. George Dickey suggested that the sociological institutions of the art world were the glue binding art and sensibility into unities. Marshall McLuhan suggested that art always functions as a counter-environment, designed to make visible what is usually invisible about a society. Theodor Adorno felt that the aesthetics could not proceed without confronting the role of the cultural industry in the commodification of art and aesthetic experience. Hal Foster attempted to portray the reaction against beauty and modernist art in the anti-aesthetic essays on postmodern culture. Arthur Danto described this reaction as calophobia. André Malraux explains that the notion of beauty was connected to a particular conception of art that arose with the Renaissance and was still dominant in the 18th century, but was supplanted later. The discipline of aesthetics, which originated in the 18th century, mistook this transient state of affairs for a revelation of permanent nature of art. Brian Mazzamati suggests that to reconsider beauty following the aesthetical thought of the philosophy of Deleuze and Garteni is important. Walter Benjamin echoed Malraux in believing aesthetics was a comparatively recent invention, a view proven wrong late in the 1970s when Abraham Moles and Frieder Nake analyzed links between beauty, information processing, and information theory. Dennis Dutton in The Art Instinct also proposed that an aesthetic sense was vital for evolutionary factor. Jean-Francis Letort re-invokes the Kantian distinction between taste and the sublime. Sublime painting, unlike kitsch realism, will enable us to see only by making it impossible to see. It will please only by causing pain. Sigmund Freud inaugurated aesthetic thinking in psychoanalysis, mainly via the uncanny as an aesthetical effect. Following Freud, the Merleau-Ponty Jacques Lacan theorized aesthetics in terms of sublimation and the thing. The relation of Marxist aesthetics to postmodern aesthetics is still a contentious area of debate, however. Recent aesthetics. Guy Cirillo has pioneered efforts in analytics philosophy to develop rigorous theory of aesthetics, focusing on the concepts of beauty, love, and sublimity. In contrast to Romantic theorists, Cerello argued that the objectivity of beauty and formulated a theory of love on that basis. British philosopher and the theorist of conceptual art aesthetics, Peter Osborne, makes the point that post-conceptual art aesthetic does not concern a particular type of contemporary art, so much as the historical ontogulation condition for the production of contemporary art in general. Osborne noted that the contemporary art is post-conceptual in a public lecture delivered in 2010. Gary Tedman has put forward a theory of subjectiveness aesthetics delivered from and derived from Karl Marx's conception of alienation and Louis Althusser's animation, using elements of Freud's group psychology, defining a concept of aesthetic level of practice. Gregory Lowen has suggested that the subject is key in the interaction with the aesthetic object. The work of art serves as a vehicle for the projection of the individual's identity into the world of objects, as well as being the interruptive source of much of what is uncanny in modern life. As well, art is used to memorialize individuated biographies in a manner that allows persons to imagine that they are part of something greater than themselves. Aesthetics and science. The field of experimental aesthetics was founded by Gustav Theodor Fechner in the 19th century. Experimental aesthetics in these times had been characterized by a subject-based inductive approach, the analysis of individual experience and behavior based on experimental methods is a central part of experimental aesthetics. In particular, the perception of works of art, music, or modern items such as websites or other IT products is studied. Experimental aesthetics is strongly orientated towards the natural sciences. Modern approaches mostly come from the fields of cognitive psychology or neuroscience, such as neuroaesthetics. In the 1970s, Abraham Moles and Friedrich Naik were among the first to analyze links between aesthetics, information processing, and information theory. In the 1990s, Jürgen Siebenholder, I am once again apologetic that I probably got that wrong, he described an algorithmic theory of beauty which takes the subjectivity of the observer into account and postulates among several observations classified as comparable by a given subjective observer. The aesthetically most pleasing one is the one with the shortest description, given the observer's previous knowledge of his particular method for encoding the data. This is closely related to the principles of algorithmic information theory and minimum description length. One of his examples, mathematicians enjoy simple proofs with a short description in their formal language. Another very concrete example describes an aesthetically pleasing human face. His proportions can be described by very few bits of information, drawing inspiration from less detailed 15th century proportional studies by Leonardo da Vinci and Albert Dürer. The theory also explicitly distinguishes between what's beautiful and what is interesting, stating that the interestingness corresponds to the first derivative of subjectively perceived beauty. Here, the premise is that any observer continually tries to improve the predictability and compressibility of the observations by discovering regularities, such as repetitions and symmetries and fractal self-similarity. Whenever the observer's learning process, which may be a predictive artificial neural network, also see neuroaesthetics, leads to improved data compression, such as the observation sequence can be described by fewer bits than before, the temporary interestingness of the data corresponds to the number of saved bits. This compression and progress is a progress in proportion to the observer's internal reward, also called the curiosity reward. A reinforcement learning algorithm is used to maximize future expected reward by learning to execute action sequences that cause additional interest input in data with yet unknown but learnable predictability or regularity. The principles can be implemented on artificial agents, which then exhibit a form of artificial curiosity. Truth in beauty and mathematics. Mathematical considerations such as symmetry and complexity are used for analysis in theoretical aesthetics. This is different from the aesthetic consideration of applied aesthetics used in the study of mathematical beauty. Aesthetic considerations such as symmetry and simplicity are used in areas of philosophy such as ethics and theoretical physics and cosmology to define truth outside of empirical considerations. Beauty and truth have been argued to be nearly synonymous, as reflected in the statement "Beauty is truth, truth is beauty" in the poem Ode Je ne Rune by John Keats, or the Hindu motto that states everything in the fact of beauty. The fact that judgments of beauty and judgments of truth are both influenced by processing fluency, which is the ease at which information can be processed, has been presented. An explanation for beauty is sometimes equated with truth. Recent research found that people use beauty as an indication for truth in mathematical pattern tasks. However, scientists including the mathematician David Orell and scientist Marsilio Gleiser have argued that the emphasis on aesthetic criteria, such as symmetry, is equally incapable, or may be capable, of leading scientists astray. Computational approaches. Computational approaches to aesthetics emerged amid efforts to use computer science methods to predict, convey, and evoke emotional responses to a piece of art. In its field, and this field, aesthetics is not considered to be dependent on taste, but is a matter of cognition, and consequently, learning. In 1928, the mathematician George David Bicloff created an aesthetic measure, which adds to m equals O over c, as the ratio of order to complexity. Since about 2005, computer scientists have attempted to develop automated methods to infer aesthetic quality of images. Typically, these approaches follow a machine learning approach, where large numbers of manually rated photographs are used to detect by a company what visual properties are relevant to aesthetic quality. A study by Y.Li and C.J. Hu employed Bicloff's measurements in their satirical learning approach, where order and complexity of an image determined the aesthetic value. The image complexity was computed using information theory, while the order was determined using fractional compression. There is also the case of Aquine Engine, developed at Penn State University, that rates natural photographs uploaded by users. There have also been relatively successful attempts with regards to chess and music. Computational approaches have also been attempted in filmmaking, as demonstrated by a software model developed by Chita Dore and a group of researchers at the Watson Research Center. The tool predicted aesthetics based on the values of the narrative elements, a relative between Max Bentz's mathematical formulation of aesthetics in terms of redundancy and complexity, and theories of musical anticipation was offered using the notion of information rate. Evolutionary Aesthetics. Evolutionary aesthetics refers to evolutionary psychology theories in which the basic aesthetic preferences of Homo sapiens are argued to have evolved in order to enhance survival and reproductive success. One example being that humans are argued to find beautiful and prefer landscapes which are good habitats in the ancestral environment. Another example is that bodily symmetry and proportion are important aspects of physical attractiveness, which may be due to this indicating good health during body growth. Evolutionary explanations for aesthetic preferences are important parts of evolutionary musicology, Darwinian literature studies, and the study of evolution of emotion. Applied aesthetics. As well as being applied to art, aesthetics can also be applied to cultural objects, such as crosses or tools. For example, aesthetic coupling between art objects and medical topics was made by speakers working for the U.S. Information Agency. Art slides were linked to slides of pharmacological data, which improved attention and retention by simultaneous activation of intuitive right brain with the rational left. It can also be used in topics as diverse as cartography, mathematics, gastronomy, fashion, and even website design. Having analyzed a number of different philosophical ideologies behind the idea of aesthetics, I think it's important to weigh both sides, so let's look at the criticisms. The philosophy of aesthetics as a practice has been criticized by some sociologists and writers of art and society. Raymond Williams, for example, argues that there is no unique or individual aesthetic object which can be extrapolated from the art world, but rather that there is a continuum of cultural forms and experiences of which ordinary speech and experiences may signal as art. By art, we may frame several artistic works or creations as though, through this reference remains, with the institution or special event which creates it, and this leaves some work or other possible art outside the framework, or other interpretations such as phenomenon which may not be considered as art. Pierre Bourdieu disagrees with Kant's idea of the aesthetic. He argues that Kant's aesthetic merely represents an experience, that is, a product formed by an elevated class habituous and scholarly leisure, as opposed to possible and equal valid aesthetic experiences, which lay outside Kant's narrow definition. Timothy Laurie argues that theorists of musical aesthetics, framed entirely in terms of appreciation, contemplation, or reflection idealize and have risk of idealizing an implausibly unmotivated listener, defined solely through musical objects, rather than seeing them as a person for whom complex intentions and motivations produce variable attractions to cultural objects and practices. In conclusion, I don't think there ever will be an airtight definition for what the idea of an aesthetic is. I think in the modern connotation we can use it colloquially to mean a certain image or certain vibe that's given off an image. However, that may be debated through the various definitions that I had shared earlier in the video. I would love to know what you think, and I think that my opinion is just going to be when I'm talking, the idea of an aesthetic would be probably something like, if I say, oh, this thing is aesthetic, I'm probably referring to the fact it looks nice and it has a cohesive, look to it, a cohesive beauty. However, I think if we're talking in terms of philosophical ideology, I'm more inclined to agree with the evolutionary ideas behind aesthetics. But, as I said earlier, I would definitely love to know what you think, what your theories are, so please comment them. That's going to be it for today's video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up. I would really appreciate it. And subscribe. I post once a week every week. It seems that day has become Wednesday, so I guess I'm going to have to start saying I post once a week on Wednesday every week. And yeah, so you can subscribe for that. And I do videos like this, and I also have a literary series on my channel where I analyze different books, so I can link that down below, and I will, probably. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to give it a thumbs up, comment, subscribe. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a nice day.